Self-consciousness, which on the whole knows itself to be reality, has its object in its own self, but is an object which initially is merely for self-consciousness, and does not as yet possess objective being which confronts it as a reality other than its own. And self-consciousness, by behaving as a being for self, aims to see itself as another independent being. This primary end is to become aware of itself as an individual in the other self-consciousness, or to make this other into itself. It is certain that this other is in principle already itself. Insofar as it has lifted itself out of the ethical substance and the tranquil being of thought to its being for self, it has left behind the law of custom and existence, the knowledge acquired through observation and theory, as a gray shadow which is in the act of passing out of sight. For the latter is rather a knowledge of something whose being for self and actuality are other than those of this self-consciousness. Instead of the heavenly seeming spirit of the universality of knowledge and action, which the feeling and enjoyment of individuality are stilled, there has entered into it the spirit of the earth, for which true actuality is merely that being, which is the actuality of the individual consciousness. It despises intellect and science, the supreme gifts of man. It has given itself to the devil and must perish. Here, entering paragraph 360, it's worth taking a little bit of a pause and looking at the structure of the work that we're now right in the middle of. So this is the first paragraph in a very short section, a subsection of a subsection, called Pleasure and Necessity, Lust und Notwendigkeit. What's going on here is a dialectical development, and we're going to see two other ones occurring that are a bit longer, the one having to do with the law of the heart, and then the other one having to do with virtue. And in each of these, we begin with something that is a common human experience. It's something that we can, you might say, commit ourselves to and live our way through and learn about in the process, and that people have been doing throughout history. This becomes particularly acute in the modern period, but it's not as if we don't have a lot of, you might say, evidences or narratives of this in the ancient period, and it's across cultures as well. Now, what Hegel is discussing here, if we look at the paragraphs that we've just proceeded through, is how the individual self-consciousness, the reasoning human being, is trying to find and to pursue their Glück, their happiness. What is happiness? How should we understand it? How should we conceive of it? What do we need to do in order to enjoy happiness? And what do we learn in the process? What we're going to see in each of these sections is that happiness is always something that we've got a clear sight at and we're pursuing, and then somehow what we grasp turns out not to be it. We also learn in that same process that what we thought we were pursuing leads us into a different path, and now we come face to face with something else than what we were striving for originally, which then primes us for moving into another dialectical progression. These are what Hegel calls shapes of consciousness, Gestalten des Bewusstseins. And what we're seeing here is something that can play itself out in an entire culture, in groups, in individuals, and Hegel is focusing here primarily on the individual. Now, why is he beginning with pleasure? Well, there's a few things to say about this before we actually get into paragraph 360. One is, if you're looking for an exposition of hedonism and its flaws and faults that is particularly vivid or concrete, this is not the place to look. As a matter of fact, I don't think that you can find a more abstract, and I don't say boring abstract the way some abstract treatments are, but a more abstract treatment of something that we think that we know all about, that is pleasure, right? And hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure as the good for the human being. What we see in here in Hegel is just the barest sketch of what pleasure might in fact be. There's no lingering over any concrete examples. There is a reference to Goethe's Faust, but it's really just in terms of this, spirit of the earth. And so we have to do a lot of filling in the gaps ourselves. And so that's part of why I put this over here. And we'll come back to this in a moment. Because I think it's important for us to try to keep in mind some concrete examples of what he might be talking about, and to specify what Hegel is not actually talking about. When he's talking about pleasure, I'll just reveal this. When he's talking about pleasure, he's not talking about the pleasure that a person might get, say, in taking drugs or drinking alone or something like that. He seems to have something more in mind that involves another self-consciousness. So we'll come back to that in a moment. So all that said, he says, self-consciousness knows itself to be reality, has its object in its own self, but as an object which initially is merely for self-consciousness and does not as yet possess objective being which confronts it as a reality other than its own. So self-consciousness grasps itself in its relation to its objects, in part the whole world. But here we're talking about, as commentators have recognized, no longer the world as the world of just material objects, but a social world, a world of imbued and shared meanings. And self-consciousness, the individual self-consciousness, has broken with that in certain respects, broken from the ethical substance. So he goes on and he says, self-consciousness, by behaving as a being for self, aims to see itself as another independent being. So in being conscious of itself and setting aims or goals, or trying to satisfy its own desires, or having a self-image, or thinking about itself in certain ways, self-consciousness is trying to discover what in fact it really is. And it doesn't want to have just a vague notion of this. It wants to grasp it in its essence. And so what we're talking about here in terms of pleasure is grasping itself in terms of its own activity of pursuing and enjoying pleasure. So you might say, there's a lot of tell me who you are things out there, right? Briot-Severin has, tell me what you eat and I'll know what you are, roughly paraphrased, right? Other people say, tell me what you read and I'll tell you who you are, right? Hegel is considering the you might say, possibility or the tradition even of saying you know a person through their pleasures. A person knows him or herself through enjoyment. There's really something to that, by the way. And I don't want to have that left out of the picture, and I don't think Hegel does either. But it's going to be somewhat limited and one-sided, as we'll see. So he goes on and he says, this primary end is to become aware of itself as an individual in the other self-consciousness. The individual wants to make sense, wants to understand, wants to grasp itself in the other self-consciousness. And he says, or to make this other into itself. It is certain that this other is in principle already itself. Now, he says, insofar as it's lifted itself, and I don't have the ethical substance down here, I have it up here, because it has lifted itself in a way. It's revolted, you might say. It's realized that what the ethical substance set up for itself, its role, its economic processes, all those sorts of things, don't exhaust its own meaning. The self-consciousness has lifted itself out of this realm of the ethical substance, and Hegel names several of the aspects of that. In doing so, he says, it's left the tranquil being of thought to its being for self. It has left behind the law of custom and existence, the knowledge acquired through observation and theory, which is a gray shadow, which is in the act of passing out of sight. And he says, that is a knowledge of something whose being for self and actuality are other than those of this self-consciousness. Now that is a very interesting thing for Hegel to say, isn't it? Because, we know Hegel is an idealist, right? So he's supposed to be all about theory and all about knowledge. And we know that he thinks that the society, the culture is where spirit really resides. So the law of custom, or if you like, mores, Sitte, and existence, Dasein, all of those things are, what we should be saying, oh yeah, that's very, very important. Self-consciousness in going against those things, in minimizing them, you could say, is in fact limiting itself. It is tearing itself out of its matrix of meaning, where it can do things. Well, yes, that's true in a sense. And it also leaves something out. We like to have fun. We like to enjoy ourselves. It's not all about being minds that then just happen to have bodies, and maybe, like Descartes says, the pilot in the ship steers the body around to do things. No, Hegel is somebody, if you want to call him an idealist, he is a materialist idealist, meaning that our body is the locus for our agency, for our experience of the totality of existence. And desire and pleasure are an integral part of that. It could be, as innocent a pleasure as sitting in the sun and basking in its rays. It could be as debauched a pleasure as anything you could possibly find through, some hunting and seeking on the internet, right? But that's going to be an integral part of our existence. And that's where we end up moving away. It's individuals who enjoy pleasure, right? So he goes on and he says, instead of the heavenly seeming spirit of the universality of knowledge and action, in which the feeling and enjoyment of individuality are stilled, that would be, this ethical substance, there is entered into it something else, the spirit of the earth, for which true actuality is merely that being which is the actuality of the individual consciousness. What is real, what is true even, which is more than what is real for Hegel. There's more to be said about that, but not at this point. What is real is the being of the individual consciousness, its actuality. The prosaic example of this, in graduate school, we used to have these great seminars, and we'd sit in the classroom and we'd be reading Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. I was actually reading it in German at the time. There's an old long story about that in the old German script, and then going line by line through the text with the rest of the class. And then we would have a break, and we would all go, those of us who smoked, we'd all go downstairs and go outside and get our cigarettes out and start smoking away and enjoying ourselves. And then we'd start talking some more about what was going on in the class. And that was an important part of the actual class. It was not part of the syllabus. It was not part of anything else. But it was, a time to reflect, a time to communicate, a time to share. And it was a time to do so precisely in order to satisfy our bodies and our addicted minds' desire for a certain kind of pleasure. And we could go on and on and on with examples like this. Now, he's got this beautiful quote from Goethe that the English doesn't really do justice to. It despises intellect and science, the supreme gifts of man. It has given itself to the devil and must perish, from Goethe's Faust. What he's talking about there is he's using that as a sort of, way of highlighting the individuality of pleasure-seeking and pleasure-taking. Now, I said we're going to mention kinds of pleasure, and this is important as we're moving into this section to talk about this. So there's a lot of different ways in which we could enjoy pleasure, right? There's a sort of pleasure about being in an environment, or, this person in relation to world. Going out into a forest, if you really do see the trees and don't see the forest, you're not enjoying the forest, right? At a certain point, you need to be encompassed by what you're enjoying. Same thing going out and fishing on the lake, something I very much enjoy, There's something about the dappling of the water and the sounds, and, you do catch a fish here and there, if you're lucky. But a lot of it is, looking into this expanse of waves moving back and forth, reflecting the sky, reflecting other things. Then there's persons enjoy experiences or things. Drinking is a great example of that. It's fun to drink, right? I particularly like to drink IPAs because I enjoy the particular bitterness and the hop taste and, the buzz that comes along with it, and, different other things, the mouthfeel of the beer. We could talk about all sorts of other things. Some people like drinking whiskey. Some people like drinking absinthe. I've never tried that, but I've heard it's quite interesting. Some people like doing other things, taking other things that affect the body in different ways. And it might not be about the sense of taste or smell at that point. It might merely be the effect of the drug on the body. But that's not experiencing another person, right? That's not a relation of self-consciousness to the other self-consciousness, unless you're hallucinating and you think that the drug that you're taking is somehow sentient or something like that. So that's not what Hegel has in mind, actually, when he's talking about hedonism here and pleasure. Person and another person. There's a good argument to be made in interpreting this paragraph and the next two paragraphs to come that maybe Hegel is talking about something like romantic involvements or even physical love or sexuality. I don't know. To me, it seems a little bit iffy, but in part that's a good thing because it means that we could also be talking about the conversation that we're having with somebody or enjoying, something. But sometimes we are, trying to enjoy the other person, and perhaps the other person is trying to enjoy us as well. Hopefully that's the case. And so we've got a different kind of pleasure there in person to other person. Then we have person with other person, right? We like watching the game together. We enjoy going fishing together. We sit around and drink some really good coffee together or something along those lines and remark on it. And our pleasure is enhanced by the fact that we are sharing it with another human being, another self-consciousness. And then I think we also need to keep in mind that for many people, pleasure is something that they do conspicuously, and they do it because they think that they ought to enjoy it, because other people have told them that they human beings do enjoy it, and they are a human being, so they'd better get with the program and try that out and enjoy it. And sometimes our pleasure is done so that we can have other people seeing us enjoying that pleasure. Now, what Hegel is talking about, I think, is primarily these two: pleasure in the other person, pleasure with the other person. So keep that in mind as we move into these sections. It plunges, therefore, into life and indulges to the full the pure individuality in which it appears. It does not so much make its own happiness as straightway take it and enjoy it. The shadowy existence of science, laws, and principles which alone stand between it and its own reality vanishes like a lifeless mist, which cannot compare with the certainty of its own reality. It takes hold of life much as a ripe fruit is plucked, which readily offers itself to the hand that takes it. Paragraph 361 is very exciting, and for those of us who've enjoyed pleasure, particularly in our youth, once we got over particular hang-ups and realized just how much there was out there in the world to appreciate and to enjoy, it may come as an interesting reminiscence, something that we can relate to. What we're going to find, of course, later is that it's empty, but right now we want to look at sort of the first blush of the pursuit of pleasure as Hegel's depicting it. So he talks about, well, let's look at the text itself. He says, it plunges therefore into life and indulges to the full the pure individuality in which it appears. So what is it there? It is self-consciousness, the self-conscious individual, the person, and it plunges itself into life. Remember that life for Hegel has this sense of like a plenitude of different actualities and possibilities. There may be something like a booming, buzzing confusion, like James talks about later on, involved in this. But life is this expanse that cannot be contained, so it jumps right into the life, and it does so, and it takes on the form of pure individuality, because it's not absolutely necessary that a self-consciousness be pure individuality. It's interesting if you think about it. There's quite a few social theories that begin with the individual, right? Because that's what they want to find in the end, is the individual. But Hegel tends to be a little skeptical of those sorts of views. The individual never turns out to be a pure individual, like this island by itself. But in pleasure and pleasure seeking and pleasure taking and pleasure enjoying, that's probably where we come closest to it, and it makes you suspect that under these high-minded theories of individualism, there might not just be a kind of hedonism lurking below the surface. So Hegel says it plunges into life, right? And here he says it does not so much make its own happiness. It's not a active, laborious process. Instead, it's finding in life what can make it happy. It takes it, he says. It takes it and enjoys it. It doesn't build it. It doesn't, in a certain sense, earn it. Right? It just goes out and gets it. And there's people who have this as a kind of advice. Hey man, you're young, go enjoy yourself. Go do this, go do that, right? And it gets even more stark here because he says, the shadowy existence of science, laws, and principles, right? Wissenschaft. Remember, that's what this is all about, Wissenschaft. Gesetzen. This could be laws, in the sense of the laws that you have to obey because that's what your society tells you. It could also be like psychological laws, logical laws that we saw in the earlier observing reason section, and principles, Grundsätzen, right? Very abstract way of talking here. So fundamental, adages about how you ought to behave. All of that becomes shadowy when presented with the possibility of getting your happiness through pursuing certain kinds of pleasures. And so, this is an experience that some of us have had, I think. He says these are shadowy. They alone stand between it, that is self-consciousness, and pure individuality. They vanish like a lifeless mist, which cannot compare with the certainty of its own reality. I go to the party and I drink and I feel, buzzed, and I'm enjoying the environment, and I see somebody who's attractive over there and I start up a conversation with them and I'm having a great time, and there's my friends over there and there's something cool happening over there. This stuff, who cares about that? It naturally loses its efficacy, its weight. It becomes insubstantial. So he says, self-consciousness takes hold of life much as a ripe fruit is plucked, which readily offers itself to the hand that takes it. So this sounds pretty good as far as a depiction of the pursuit of pleasure, doesn't it? This is something I think we can recognize. This is what hedonism looks like in practice. Its action is only in one respect an action of desire. It does not aim at the destruction of objective being in its entirety, but only at the form of its otherness or its independence, which is a show devoid of essence, for it holds this objectivity to be in principle the same essence of itself or its selfhood. The element in which desire and its object subsist as mutually indifferent and independent is animate existence. The enjoyment of desire puts an end to this existence so far as it belongs to the object of desire. But here this element which gives to both a separate actuality is rather the category, a being which is essentially in the form of thought. It is therefore the consciousness of independence, let it be natural consciousness or consciousness developed into a system of laws, which preserves the individuals, each for himself. The separation is not itself a fact for self-consciousness, which knows the other as its own selfhood. It attains, therefore, to the enjoyment of pleasure, to the consciousness of its actualization in a consciousness which appears as independent, or to the vision of the unity of the two independent self-consciousnesses. It attains its end, but only to learn there what the truth of that end is. It comprehends itself as this particular individual who exists for himself, but the realization of this end is itself the setting aside of the latter. For it is not as this particular individual that it becomes an object to itself, but rather as the unity of itself and the other self-consciousness. Hence, as an individual that is only a moment or a universal. By the end of paragraph 362, we're going to see Hegel beginning to show us how the seeking of pleasure as the happiness for the independent self-consciousness turns out to be not illusory as such, but it just doesn't provide what it's supposed to, and it ends up transmuting into something that's not quite its opposite, but it certainly is something very different than what the person was aiming for or looking for. So this is actually the paragraph that I think leads commentators to think that here what he means by pleasure is, at least not exclusively, but in its paradigm, sexual pleasure. The pleasure of enjoying intimacy or engagement, or however you want to frame it, maybe just getting it on with another body, but a body that isn't just a lifeless, limp thing, but is another human being, where there's a back and forth. There's a connection there, right? And what he's sketching out can fit that. I think it could fit a lot of other things as well. So what does Hegel say? He says its action is only in one respect an action of desire. Why is it in only one respect? Well, he says it doesn't aim at the destruction of the object the way that it did earlier in the self-consciousness section, when we talked about Begierde or desire. Instead, what it wants to do is to have that object sort of remaining in place while it continues to enjoy it and thereby knows itself in that object. So he says, it doesn't aim at the destruction of its objective being in its entirety, only at the form of its otherness or its independence. It holds this objectivity to be in principle the same essence as itself or its selfhood. It's engaging with the other, with the object, and it doesn't want the object to be something foreign to it, something that has its own self-subsistence, that can disappoint it, that won't respond in the way that it wants. And there's kind of a dynamic here, you know. You got to be very careful that you don't make the object too much like yourself, or else you're really just enjoying yourself, right? And then it doesn't become quite so enjoyable. But you don't want the object to be so independent that it can decide to say, no, I'm not going to give you what you want. So he goes on and he says, the element in which desire and its object subsist as mutually indifferent and independent is animate existence, right? So it's not just commodities. It's, you might say, it's commodities that have been cathected with other human desire. This is a very important point. So he goes on and he says, the enjoyment of desire puts an end to this animate existence insofar as it belongs to the object of desire. But here, this element which gives to both a separate actuality is rather the category of being which is essentially in the form of thought. Now that's a weird thing to say at this point, isn't it? We're talking about pleasure, and we're talking about desire and the object, and now suddenly Hegel says, well, it's really about the category, and that's a form of thought. And you might say, what could be more foreign to thought, abstract thought, than pleasure? Think back to sense certainty, and how sense certainty was supposed to be the most concrete, the most in your face, the most, it's right there, just waiting for you to get it. Then it turned out upon analysis to be, as Hegel said, the most abstract kind of knowledge, didn't it? It was furthest from reality, from the object, from a connection between us and the world. Pleasure has the same kind of dynamic going on here. So he goes on and he says, it's therefore the consciousness of independence. Let it be natural consciousness or consciousness developed into a system of laws. It doesn't make any difference, right? He says, the separation is not itself a fact for self-consciousness, which knows the other as its own selfhood. It attains, therefore, to the enjoyment of pleasure, to the consciousness of its actualization in a consciousness which appears as independent, or to the vision of the unity of the two independent self-consciousnesses. This talking about the unity of the two independent self-consciousnesses, I think, is why commentators have thought of this in terms of sexual desire and attraction and activity and pleasure in that sense. But I don't think that has to be our only possibility for understanding it. The point is that pleasure occurs by not just being all by yourself, say, shooting up, or getting yourself off, or drinking and watching, even if you're just watching TV, you're not just drinking, you're watching stories that other people are telling, right? So it's sort of a substitute for another self-consciousness. You lose yourself in that, by the way. So Hegel is telling us that pleasure does get its enjoyment. Desire does get its enjoyment in pleasure, right? But then it goes beyond that. Other stuff starts trickling in. You might say metaphysical stuff starts trickling in, and that's where we're getting to here. What are the things that are coming in? Two main things. Consciousness of independence, which is a correlate. You don't get the object as independent that you can then sublate, or aufheben, aufheben in German, that you can transcend and somehow connect back to yourself, unless it really does have independence. We saw this back when we looked at the other developments of self-consciousness in the self-consciousness section, didn't we? But here it goes further. The individual self-consciousness becomes aware of the unity of itself with this other self-consciousness to which it is connected in its desiring, its action, its pleasure-taking. And this means, as Hegel says, that it attains its end only to learn there what the truth of that end is. This is a really interesting framework. It comprehends itself as this particular individual who exists for himself, but the realization of this end is itself the setting aside of this latter. The latter is the comprehending itself as the particular individual who exists for himself. In trying to exist for yourself and to do so through the mode of pleasure, inevitably you find out that you're not just for yourself, you're stuck in a world of other people. Sometimes you find this out by screwing things up, right? By taking your pleasure and then somebody else says, hey, that hurts, or hey, you screwed things up for me. And you're like, oh, yeah, I guess there are other beings involved here. It can be a painful reality, right? But here's the upshot of that. Through this awareness of unity, he says it's not as this particular individual that it becomes an object to itself, the self-consciousness, but rather as the unity of itself and the other self-consciousness. It knows itself in relation to others. But that means it's an individual that is only a moment, or is a universal. Now, what is this universal? That's what remains to be discovered in the rest of this set of paragraphs.